in just a minute, so hang tight. Right. Good morning. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Preventive Controls Rule Qualified Exemption webinar. We are very pleased to have Dr. Aaron DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis with us this morning, as well as Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from the CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program. And we're going to get started with the main webinar presentation shortly, but first I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we're going to turn the videos off during the presentations, but we'll be back on during the question and answer sessions. We just want to let you know that there are people behind the voices. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. My name is Megan Donovan. I'll be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance, and she'll be fielding the questions as they come in and may hop on as the alternative host if any technical issues arise. The CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host this webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a food safety outreach program grant from the USDA National Institute in Food and Agriculture. Please note that the contents of the webinar did not necessarily reflect the official views of the USDA. And also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, we're going to do a quick Zoom tutorial. I know a lot of you are probably Zoom experts by now, but sometimes there's a couple tricky things. So we're just going to do a quick review. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with our webinar staff, click on the question and answer icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the send anonymously box to the left of the box there. And note, we're not going to be using the chat function during this webinar. So if you have any other things you need to communicate with webinar staff, just use the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll collect those and get to them at the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. And as a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides to all webinar registrants. And just to let you know, we have a nice group of folks on the line today, and we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can. If we can't get to your specific question, we just wanted to apologize in advance and encourage you to follow up after the webinar. So thanks again for attending. And with that, I'd like to introduce our lead trainer. Dr. Aaron DiCaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her area of expertise is microbial food safety, with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. Joining Erin today, we have Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from the CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program, and they'll be here to answer any organic specific questions that might come up. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And so our focus today is going to be qualified facility exemptions under the Preventive Controls rule for human food under the Food Safety Modernization Act. So what we'll go through today, just to set the stage a bit, is a definition of qualified facilities under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. So how does the regulation define these facilities? We'll talk about how you would calculate the average annual sales to determine if your business is eligible to have qualified facility status. We'll talk about filing a form 3942A with FDA. So if you are a qualified facility, this is the form you need to submit to FDA attesting to that. And then we'll end going through what the modified requirements are under this particular rule for qualified facilities. To get us started here, we wanted to get a sense of what you all are processing in your business. This is not an exhaustive list of products by any means, but we just kind of want to get a general sense of what you're making. So is it jams, jellies? Are you working with fermented fruits or vegetables? Are you producing sauces? Something else that's not on this list, or potentially this isn't applicable to you. So we'll give this another minute or two and give folks time to respond. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll end this and share the results. So it looks like we have some folks producing baked goods, dried fruits, vegetables, or herbs, and then a good number of folks producing something in the other category. So we last month had a webinar related to kind of setting the stage for how different types of food products have different levels of food safety risks. So if you weren't able to attend that last webinar, I encourage you to go back to that recording so you can kind of get a sense, if you don't already know, the risks associated with the potential or potentially with the products that you're working on. So one of the other things that we covered in the previous webinar was, kind of an overview of FSMA rules that would apply to food processors, and specifically those food processors that, may have a full or partial exemption to the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. So there are some full exemptions for food processors from this Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, and they're listed here. So first, if the processing that a manufacturer is conducting is covered by the produce safety rule, that would mean they're exempt from the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. However, this is a very limited list in terms of processing that's allowed on farm and is covered by the produce safety rule. It's essentially doing some manipulations of ripening of harvested commodities or drying of a whole intact commodity to produce a distinct product, like drying a grape to make a raisin. Other than that, that type of processing is going to fall under the Preventive Controls rule. Another type of processor that would be exempt from the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule is a processor that is making their food in a retail food establishment. So a grocery store, for example, that's doing, producing baked goods, they would be exempt from the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. And third, processors that are making food that's produced under a state cottage food law would also be exempt from the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. Other than those situations, food processors are going to be covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. However, there are some modified requirements to this regulation for facilities that meet the farm mixed type facility definition, or those that meet the criteria to be one of these qualified facilities. And that's going to be the focus of today's webinar, talking about, the definition of these qualified facilities and how to make that determination, and then those modified requirements that apply to qualified facilities. Another poll here. So if you know, what FSMA compliance category does the business you are affiliated with fall under? And so this could be, oops, I accidentally ended that poll early. Apologies. Could we relaunch that, Larissa? I'm sorry. So if you know you're already a qualified facility, go ahead, let us know that. Are you a fully subject facility? Are you one of these farm mixed type facilities? So you're doing processing on the farm that's deemed allowable because it's a low risk activity. If you are one of these farm mixed type facilities, you're still going to have to be compliant with some of the modified requirements similar to a qualified facility under the Preventive Controls rule. You might be unsure. That's really common. It can be very confusing to kind of figure out, how this regulation applies to different business models, or this might not be applicable to you because, for example, you're a cottage food operator. So I'm going to end this poll and I'll share the results. So we have a number of folks that already know they're a qualified facility under the Preventive Controls rule. One person that's going to be working in a facility that's fully subject to the Preventive Controls rules. So our next webinar will focus on the requirements for a fully subject facility, one farm mixed type facility. Many respondents saying not sure. Again, this can be really confusing to tease out, where your business model falls under these regulations. And then one respondent not applicable. So maybe that processor is allowed to do that processing under the produce safety rule, or this is a cottage food operation. So overall, some diverse business models on the webinar here today. I also want to point out, before we get into the requirements under the FSMA Preventive Controls rule, that there are also special considerations for organic food processors. So of course you have the organic regulations to also implement beyond these food safety regulations. So I just want to point out, some key areas to, be thinking about as an organic processor. First, kind of any chemistries that you're using for post-harvest operations or that are being utilized for cleaning and sanitation. Those need to be approved for organic use. And then of course, the ingredients you're using in your formulated processed product as well. So always check in with your organic certifier to make sure that, what you're planning to do, is going to, meet those organic requirements, beyond these other food safety regulations that I'm going to be talking about today. And so when the FSMA regulation was written, there was at least some recognition that the implementation of the preventive controls for human food rule, as well as the other 6 rules under this regulation, needed to be appropriate to the scale of the business. And so in the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, there is a provision that sets modified requirements to the rule for very small businesses. However, even though, there are these modified requirements for very small businesses, as a food processor, it's the responsibility of anyone in this industry, regardless of their size, to ensure that the food that is being produced is safe and is not going to pose a risk to human health. And so I mentioned this in our previous FSMA 101 webinar, but essentially, as the number of individuals that consume your product increases, that's going to increase the overall risk to public health. So the more people that consume a product, the higher that risk is going to be if that product is not produced in a safe manner. We also touched on in the FSMA 101 webinar that there are different food types that are considered lower risk compared to others. So a low water activity, high acid food is generally going to be considered a lower risk food. Baked goods, most of them also fall in that category. However, there are what we call high-risk food types. Typically, these are going to be low acid or acidified canned food products that pose a very significant risk to human health if they're not produced under very controlled conditions. And so for those high-risk food types, really, regardless of the size of your operation, there are going to be many food safety regulations that apply to their production just because of the potential risk to public health there. So to help to reduce the burden for very small businesses, the Preventive Controls Rule defines this criteria for, what is a qualified facility. So these facilities that won't be subject to the full requirements of this particular rule. So these are very small businesses as defined in this particular regulation. And this isn't a full exemption. Again, this is just modified requirements. So not every single piece of the rule is going to apply, but several pieces do. And so one of the things that will apply to these qualified facilities is following good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. So these GMPs were revised in the Preventive Controls Rule. So qualified facilities are going to have to follow those new updated GMPs under the Preventive Controls Rule. You'll also have to file with FDA and submit this attestation that you meet the requirements of a qualified facility, but you do not have to conduct the hazard analysis and implement preventive controls as defined under the regulation. So that does reduce a significant amount of the burden of this particular regulation. However, we'll talk about you're still required to control hazards in the products that you're producing, and that can be accomplished by several mechanisms, which we'll touch on in just a few minutes. So you're eligible for this qualified facility designation if you meet one of these 2 criteria. The first is having less than $1 million in annual sales of human food. And this $1 million number is adjusted for inflation. So 1 million was based on 2011 market value of foods. The other option to be eligible for this qualified facility exemption is to have less than $500,000 in annual sales over the last 3 years and sell a majority of that food directly to qualified end users. So these qualified end users are also defined in the regulation, and these are consumers, restaurants, or retail food establishments in the same state or not further than 275 miles from that food processing facility. So if you meet either one of these two criteria, then you would be eligible to be a qualified facility and be exempted from certain parts of the preventive controls for human food rule. I know the text here is a little bit small. This is a screenshot of the FDA's Qualified Facility Attestation website. I just wanted to point this out as a really useful resource. You can find here FDA guidance documents for qualified facilities. They have a lot of great examples for doing the calculations, how to kind of account for more complicated business models in doing those calculations. So a really nice resource. You can also find the instructions for submitting your facility attestation form 3942A, as well as that form on this page. And then they also have a link here to the inflation adjusted cutoff rates for each year since the regulation was put into place. And so I'll show you that table here in a few minutes as well. So now we've set the stage by defining a qualified facility. So I want to get into how a business will determine if that criteria is met. And so first off, the FDA is not going to make this determination for a business. A business owner is responsible for doing the calculation to determine if their business meets the criteria of a qualified facility. However, FDA will be verifying this information. So it's very important to keep the paper trail of how you made that determination, because they may come into your facility and be asking you to provide that documentation to prove that in fact you are eligible to be a qualified facility. The calculation of the annual sales of human food needs to be done every year. So you're going to have to do this calculation once a year, and it's defined in the regulation that it needs to be done no later than July 1st of each calendar year. So this is going to be kind of an ongoing process to make sure year after year that you're still meeting those requirements to be considered a qualified facility. The calculation includes all human food that is sold or currently being held in your inventory. So this is all human food, regardless if that food is covered by other food safety regulations. And so you would, of course, include all of the foods that are subject to oversight of the preventive controls for human food rule, but you would also include in that calculation other foods that you're producing that would be subject to other food safety regulations and therefore be exempted from oversight by FDA under the preventive controls for human food rules. So that would include things like juice that's covered by the FDA's juice HACCP regulations, USDA regulated products like meat or poultry. And so it's just important that, you realize that even though some of these foods aren't going to be covered by this particular regulation in terms of implementation of food safety systems, you still have to include those foods if you're producing them in this calculation that you're making to determine if you're a qualified facility. So how to calculate this average annual sales. So this is a 3-year average. And so first you need to determine which 3 years you need to include in the calculation. Next, for each one of those years, you need to determine the market value of your food processed that you've packed or you're currently holding in inventory. Then those annual sales and market value need to be adjusted for inflation for each one of those years. And then finally, you would calculate the average of those 3 years, and that number will determine whether or not you're eligible for that qualified facility designation. So the average is based on the 3-year period preceding the applicable calendar year. So we're in 2021. So for this calculation, you would use the sales and market value from 2018, 2019, and 2020 to calculate the average annual sale for the purposes of qualified facility eligibility. If you've not been in operation for 3 years, FDA allows for using the previous 2 years or 1 year average annual sales to make the determination. If you're just starting out as a food business, you're also allowed to just project that number to begin with. You've probably done that in your business planning already. So if that number is below $1 million, then that would be your justification to FDA for being a qualified facility. You, of course, need a lot of documentation to make this calculation. So all of those documents, so, tax forms, accounting documents, whatever resources you're using to pull the numbers from, that information needs to be made available to FDA if they request it. Also to note here, the calculation does not get adjusted for the cost of sales. So for example, you would not adjust that total for the cost of labor. So you're not going to be subtracting out your operational costs from that calculation. You also, in this calculation, don't remove the cost of food that's sold directly to qualified end users. So if you're selling some of your product wholesale, some of your product direct to consumers, you would include both the wholesale and the sales to consumers in this calculation. And so FDA, so you're going to have to do some adjustments of these numbers to, make so that $1 million number that, kind of is the determining limit for a qualified facility or not was based on numbers in 2011. So you do need to adjust your sales and market value numbers for each year to accommodate for, that 2011 number. And so FDA publishes an average for the current calendar year for the implicit price deflator for the gross domestic product on their website. I personally have had a little bit of a struggle trying to determine how to utilize this table and the directions they provided, but admittedly, I am not an accountant. So some of you that have more experience and are more savvy in that realm probably know how to use these numbers to your advantage. But you can find this table and the directions on that FDA Qualified Facility Attestation website that I referenced. So the FDA will allow for you to use this table in the calculation, adjusting your sales number for inflation, or you can use this other method, which is previously how I've instructed people to do the calculation. And for me, it seems a little more straightforward. So for each year that you're including in this calculation, you would multiply the sum of your annual sales and market value of human food by the 2011 implicit price deflator index number, which you can find on FDA's website in that table, or by going to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis's website, which is linked here as well. So you would take your current year's annual sales market value, multiply that by the 2011 implicit price deflator index number, and then divide that value by the current year or the year that you're doing the calculation for's implicit price deflator index number. So the answer you get from doing this calculation is your inflation adjusted sales plus market value number. So you're going to do that for each of the 3 years that you're including in the calculation. And then you're going to take the average of those 3 years. So divide by 3. If this number is less than $1 million, then you're eligible for the qualified facility designation. And so here are just some examples of what you would include in this number for annual sales and market value. So here in this example, we have a jam producer that's selling to local restaurants and wholesale. We have here the number for staff wages and the value of held inventory of this jam. And again, these are totally made up numbers. And so to calculate that average annual sales and market value, we would include the sales to local restaurants, wholesale, as well as the value of that jam that we're currently holding in inventory. So here our annual sale is $800,000. So we're below that $1 million threshold and would be eligible for qualified facility status. In this other example, we have a business that's producing jam, again, selling to restaurants, selling wholesale. The same business is also producing juice and eggs. So juice and eggs, they're going to be exempt from the preventive controls for human food rule. And this business is selling the juice and the eggs to restaurants, farmers markets, as well as wholesale. So as I already mentioned, you have to include all human food in this calculation, not just the foods that are covered by the preventive controls for human food rule. So here we would have to include all the sales from the jam, juice, and eggs, and all those to qualified end users, as well as wholesale. So in this example, we're over that $1 million sales threshold. And so this business would be subject to the full requirements of the preventive controls for human food rule. Of course, with all regulations, there's a lot of documentation required. When you're a qualified facility, you also have to have documentation to show FDA that you meet that definition under the regulation. So you have to have records showing that your business meets this qualified facility definition. So records are required to support the attestations that you're going to be making in this form 3941A, which is the form that you submit to FDA designating that you are a qualified facility. In addition, you need to keep all of the records used for making your calculations, as well as the actual calculations that you made. So you need to keep all of the records that went into making the calculation, as well as the actual math that you did to make the designation that you're under that $1 million threshold. So these records are going to be subject to the record keeping requirements under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, which I'll touch on later as well. But essentially, they need to be legible, indelible, and you need to keep those records on hand for 2 years after they were generated. This is the form 3942A that's available online from that website I showed previously. So this is kind of the header of the form. So a business will have to provide the FDA's facility registration number for the business. So you're also going to have to register with FDA prior to filing this form. Of course, you have to provide the name of the business, the address, contact information, and then the type of notification that you're submitting to FDA. So is this your initial submission to FDA, your first qualified facility attestation form? Is this your biennial renewal submission? So you do have to resubmit this form every 2 years, or is this a status change? So you're going to have to be doing this calculation every year, remember? And so there might be a scenario where your business grows and you're no longer eligible for this qualified facility attestation. So you also have to inform FDA when you're no longer a qualified facility. Next, you would select which criteria qualifies you to be one of these qualified facilities. So are you under that $1 million annual sales threshold, or do you meet the requirement that you're, under $500,000 over 3 years, and that you're selling primarily to these qualified end users? The last piece is, informing FDA that you, even though you are one of these qualified facilities, that you've identified and are controlling hazards in your facility. So this can be accomplished one of 2 ways. So you would check one of these boxes. The first is that you've conducted your own hazard analysis and you're implementing controls for hazards identified. This is essentially analogous to full coverage under the Preventive Controls Rule. Not necessarily a bad thing by any stretch of the word, but just note that, if this is the route that you take, that you're going to have a lot of internal documentation that's required to support that you did the hazard analysis and are controlling those hazards. Or the second option is that you're in compliance with your state, local, county, tribal, or other applicable non-federal food safety regulations. I will say that many state regulations are also going to require that you identify hazards and are implementing controls. But you need to, define that clearly to FDA, which criteria you're employing in your business to make sure that hazards are being controlled. And then the last page is signed, stating that the information is accurate and that you're keeping records to support the qualified facility designation. FDA does prefer that you submit this attestation form electronically, and you can kind of get to that electronic submission through the Qualified Facility Attestation FDA page, but you can also download a hard copy of this form and mail it directly to FDA. And there's instructions for how to do that on the website as well. This form needs to be filed before you begin operations. When the regulation was first being implemented, there was kind of a grace period in this filing, but this regulation is now fully implemented and there's no more grace period. So before you start operations, you need to file this attestation form. And as I already mentioned, this form needs to be resubmitted every 2 years. And this is during the food facility biannual registration renewal period. So when you register with FDA as a food processing facility, you also have to resubmit every 2 years. So this attestation would happen at the same time as that 2-year facility registration. If your business grows, you also have to notify FDA when your business is no longer a qualified facility. So I already mentioned this, you definitely want to be proactive here and kind of not let FDA find out on their own terms that you're no longer one of these qualified facilities. So you do want to, make sure you're doing those calculations every year. And as soon as you cross that threshold where you're no longer a qualified facility, notify FDA as soon as possible. So we'll pause here. I know that was a lot of information, kind of rapid fire, but I'd like to address any questions that have come up in the Q&A.
Thanks, Erin. So one question did come in during the presentation, so we'll start with that. And then I wanted to encourage folks to write in any other questions that may have come up. And also just to reiterate what Erin said, that's a lot of information. So if you're still sort of digesting it and think of something in the second half of the presentation, feel free to just go ahead and write it in then. So we have a organic nut producer that wrote in and said that this is their first harvest and they've never sold nuts before. And basically they're just going to sell them in shell. So they're just drying them and selling them, and wanted to know kind of where they, how this regulation may apply to them.
I'll let others jump in if they like. But it sounds like what they're doing would fall under the produce safety rule and not this particular regulation. So there are, of course, a lot of food safety requirements for growers and also for harvesting operations under the produce safety rule. But it sounds like since you're not doing, any shelling, you're not doing, any other kind of post processing, that this more likely would be considered, a raw agricultural commodity and fall under the jurisdiction of the produce safety rule, if you will, rather than this particular regulation that's geared more to the processing side of things. It gets a little dicey when we're talking about, someone that's doing some kind of cutting, slicing, more of a fresh cut operation, or someone that's, slicing a fruit and doing drying, that is processing, but it sounds like this is something that would fall under the produce safety rule.
Great, thank you. And we had another person that's still a little unsure of whether they're a qualified facility or not, and was wondering if there's a database that has the information that is presented or other resources to kind of help them figure out where they fall.
Yeah, and it's so complicated. It's not an easy thing to do. So the FDA's guidance document, I think has some good examples in it. So, that's a good starting point. I would also say that there are a lot of great resources through university extension that try and make it a little more clear. NSAC has some good guidance documents as well, which I don't think I included in the resource list, so I can try and pull those out and put them in the chat. But I think kind of the hardest starting point is really pulling together all the documentation and trying to figure out, where you currently stand. So, what is your annual sales and market value of all the human food you are selling and holding? And then once you have, kind of a sense of that, you might have more specific questions that you want to ask. And so, if you can't kind of get to those answers through resources online, we're here in University Extension to work with you. So you can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to help walk you through everything. It's case by case basis, right? And so, once you have kind of pulled together that initial documentation and have kind of a sense of where you are, if you're still having trouble, I'm here as a resource. Please feel free to reach out. And a lot of this takes kind of one-on-one back and forth to tease it out.
Great, thank you. And just a note for the folks in the audience, we will be sending out Erin's contact information at the end of the webinar. So you'll have access to that if you're still confused after sort of wading through the numbers a little more. We had another person write in that asked, if you're already producing food, the last part of your presentation talked about even years. So are things due October 1st through December 31st of the next year?
Yeah, so typically FDA likes those resubmissions every 2 years, but it's on the even year. So yeah, that would be 2022 is when that resubmission would occur. If you're not currently registered though and haven't submitted those forms, you would want to do that off cycle. So you wouldn't want to wait until 2022 if you don't have any of that filed yet with FDA. You would want to do it now, and then they may want you to resubmit in 2022, but they may just have you wait until 2024 in that case.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to take one more question now, and then we'll loop back around to more questions at the end of the presentation. And so someone else wrote in and said, do we have a good place to see what must be done to register under the produce safety rule?
Good place. So under the produce safety rule, my current understanding is that the CDFA, at least in California, is doing the inspections on behalf of FDA. Here in California, I think many other states have a similar model where you're not going to have an FDA inspector on your farm. And I believe that kind of the approach is that you self-notify with CDFA that you're a grower that's going to be subject to the produce safety rule. I will also say there are some exemptions based on the size of your farm to that particular regulation as well. But they have a website. It's the CDFA's Produce Safety Program. And on that website, there is a form that you would download and then submit to them. I believe the form has, kind of the standard information, business name, contact information. They ask about, the commodities that you're growing, your acreage, your average annual sales, and that will essentially kind of enter you into CDFA's database. And then, as you come up on their list, they'll be reaching out to schedule an on-farm inspection. So that's kind of how that process would look here in California. And I think it's very similar in many other states as well.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll move on to the second half of the presentation, but again, if we haven't gotten to your question, we'll get to that in a little bit.
Wonderful. All right, so now let's talk about the modified requirements under the preventive controls rule for human food for qualified facilities. So again, you're not fully exempt from the regulation. There are still certain pieces that you have to implement, but you're not going to have to do that really in-depth hazard analysis and implement the preventive controls as outlined under this particular regulation. That being said, some of the state and local food safety regulations will probably require a lot of similar documentation, so just be aware of that as well. But under this federal regulation, these are the general parts of the regulation that are going to apply to qualified facilities. And so these qualified facilities will be subject to the general provisions of the preventive controls for human food rule. They have to implement good manufacturing practices. They also will have to submit that attestation form to FDA. And they'll have to follow record keeping procedures as outlined under the regulation that apply to implementation of good manufacturing practices, documents that support their attestation, and documents that comply with their local or state regulations. It's also written that the FDA can revoke qualified facility status if egregious food safety issues are noted in a food processing facility, or if an outbreak occurs and was linked to products produced in that facility. The general provisions of the preventive controls rule basically states that facilities are prohibited from selling adulterated food. And so adulterated foods are those that pose a food safety risk, those that are produced under insanitary conditions, or those that are economically adulterated. So, food safety risk, that could be potentially microbial contamination. It could be allergen cross-contamination of, a non-allergenic product. It could be physical hazards that show up in a food product. So any situation where those hazards aren't being controlled and they end up in food, that food's considered adulterated. Food that's also produced under insanitary conditions. So basically where GMPs aren't being implemented and you have an unclean, unsanitized facility, those would be considered adulterated. There's also economic adulteration, where you would substitute a high value ingredient with a lower value ingredient. And so this is economic adulteration. Basically here, any food that meets these criteria is considered adulterated. So you're not allowed to produce adulterated food as a qualified facility. You're also required to implement GMPs. We'll have a final webinar on this subject, and we're planning some upcoming workshops on GMPs. But if you're unfamiliar with GMPs and you need information as soon as possible, There is an online good manufacturing practices course offered through Cornell. That's very good. So if you have an immediate need, I would recommend taking this particular course. But basically, these GMPs are required for processing safe food under sanitary conditions. And so these are the basic types of programs that are included in GMPs. And again, we'll go into some detail on each one of these programs in our final webinar in December. So documentation, so this includes the attestation form and supporting documents, as well as documentation showing that the facility is controlling hazards or complying with state, local food safety laws. So in California, we have, two basic food safety laws that apply to processors. The first is what's called the processed food registration. And this applies to a majority of food processors. There's no exemption or exclusion here based on size. You can see the types of products this applies to. The fee for the registration is based on size. So just note, if you're producing foods that are under a HACCP system, those fees increase based on the additional oversight that's needed. So I wanted to point out this resource that I helped develop that gives you kind of a snapshot of the process of applying for this processed food registration in California. So the different types of information and forms you have to file, as well as the length of time that's needed. Also note here in California that we have an organic processed food registration as well. So this is kind of unique to California, that you also have to register with the state as an organic food processor. But you would want to be working, with your certifier, throughout this process as well, just to make sure that, you're not running into any issues with being in compliance with the organic program regulations while you're trying to, follow these food safety regulations as well. We also in California have this unique program for folks that are producing low acid and acidified canned food products because of the inherent risk they pose if they're processed incorrectly. So in California, we have this cannery license program that's required for manufacturers of these types of products. So typically, this would be things like canned vegetables, canned soups, and then the acidified foods. This is, salsas, vinegar, pickles. So all of these types of manufacturers will also need a cannery license here in California. And so we also developed a timeline for, kind of how this process looks in California. You would typically submit an application for a PFR as well. So again, if you're an organic processor, you would submit that organic PFR application to the state. You would also submit a cannery license form. This process is much more complicated. I will just say it's going to require you to actually submit samples and a formulation to a state lab and have them evaluate your process and your product. And they'll issue what's called an S letter or a process letter. And so you'll need that letter in hand, which is, people look at it as kind of an approval letter. But in other states, this would be a process authority letter stating that the particular product process that you're planning to run is in fact food safe. And then with these low acid and acidified food products, once you have this cannery license, you have your S letter, your manufacturing, you're also going to have to pay for a state inspector to come in and do lot by lot inspection of release of these products. So it's significantly more expensive to have a cannery license in California as compared to the processed food registration. But, other states also have very stringent holds on production of these products. There's FDA regulations that also apply to the production of these products. So I will say here in California, once you get through our state process, you're going to have no issue at the federal level with being compliant with their low acid and acidified food regulations. And then there are record keeping requirements under this particular regulation. And this is probably similar to all documents that you're keeping, whether it's local, state, food safety, or for, your organic program, but these records need to be accurate and legible. So they need to reflect a observation or measurement that was actually taken. We need to be able to read the handwriting. Under this regulation, the records need to be kept for at least 2 years after the date they were prepared. And so for the preventive controls rule, things that you would have records for would be your financial records and the calculations that were used to determine the qualified facility status, any state food safety regulation documentation that you have, any audit records, SOPs that you might have in place. So, again, record keeping is really important because if it's not written down, if you don't have documentation for things, essentially in the eyes of these regulators, those things didn't happen. So it's critically important to keep these records. And in my work with some smaller scale processors, this can be one of the things that comes up kind of again and again as a major challenge in, things that are deficiencies during inspections. Is just having all of this supporting documentations and these records in hand. And then finally, FDA does under this regulation have the power to withdraw a qualified facility exemption under certain circumstances. The first being if there's a foodborne illness outbreak linked to a qualified facility. Hopefully that is never something that you would have to deal with as a qualified facility, but just know that if there's an outbreak, the FDA can and likely will require you to follow the full requirements of the preventive controls rule. And then if there's observations made during an inspection that pose a significant risk to human health. So if food's being produced under insanitary conditions, that's a situation where the FDA can revoke this qualified facility status and require you to be compliant with the full preventive controls requirements, which would mean, they're going to be in your facility doing these inspections on a more frequent basis. And so I'll end here just pointing you to a few useful resources. So I alluded to many of these throughout the presentation. So several FDA guidance documents, some of the forms that we talked about. California, I co-manage a website, ucfoodsafety.ucdavis.edu. And so there you can find the PFR and the cannery license timeline I showed in the previous few slides. There's a a lot of other food safety information, FSMA guidance documents on that website as well. And then for both the processed food registration and the cannery license in California, those fall under the California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch's food safety program. And so there are links here to the processed food registration page, as well as the cannery inspection program page. But if you're, interested in cottage foods or even bottling water, they have a lot of information on those programs on their website as well. So we'll pause here for more questions. Again, I know this is a lot of information to digest, and so you'll have my contact information, and you're always welcome to reach out at any time if something comes up later today or a week from today, which is usually when questions come into my mind after I listen to a talk.
Great, thank you for that overview and those nice timelines of the processed food registration. So we did have a question come in wanting to confirm the California organic food processing registration is only valid in combination with a third-party organic certification. So Erin, I'll let you start, and then Jacob, if you have anything you want to add to that, or Anna, feel free to jump in.
I would opt to let one of either Jacob or Anna jump in on that first. I think I know the response, but since I'm not the expert in that space, I'd prefer to hand that one off.
So the question is, it's about having this certification mingle with a third-party certification. Could you, sorry to have you repeat the question. I'm trying to understand it.
The question is if the California organic processed food registration is only valid in combination with a third-party organic certification.
No, it's kind of a separate thing. You got to register with the state, and sometimes they'll come by and do their own inspection of your operation, and they'll give you a state registration certificate. And that doesn't really mean that you are certified organic per the organic rules. You would need to go to and have a separate third-party organic certificate from any one of the agencies out there like CCOF. So it's kind of a separate thing, but it's really the state registration is really good for smaller producers that might be grossing less than $5,000 per year. Those folks don't have to get a third-party CCOF certification.
Great, thank you. And maybe just to clarify, because I know there's lots of different registrations. There's the California State Organic Registration, which Jacob was just talking about. And so then, Erin, maybe if you could clarify, there's also the California Food Processor Registration. So sounds like those two things are separate. And then on top of that, you have the third-party organic certification if you're above that $5,000 in organic sales.
Yeah, so it's a lot of paperwork, a lot of certifications, but yeah, so there'd be and it even gets more complicated if you're one of these folks that wants to produce an acidified or low acid canned food. So, I think have a look at the timeline and the guidance there. If there's additional questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to try and help you navigate the process. But yeah, in California, we're a little unique because we have the state organic certification system. But again, I'm happy if folks are confused, because it is confusing pointing you to which forms you need to file based on what you're planning to do and how.
Great, thank you for offering that. There definitely is a lot of paperwork. So moving on to the next question, and this one, Jacob or Anna, if you want to chime in first, is what are some common pitfalls for organic producers in terms of food safety that they might want to kind of look out for?
Yeah, I've noticed that a common issue is folks thinking they need to use really strong sanitizers on their food contact surfaces. So folks might go out and buy a quaternary ammonium sanitizer, which leaves a residue. And quaternary ammoniums are, you can use them in an organic system, but then you have to do a thorough rinse, and then there's a testing strip that you have to test the surface to make sure there's no residue left on that food contact surface. So I've seen folks, you know, in the name of food safety, they'll go out and use a very strong sanitizer, and then when we show up for their organic inspection, they're not necessarily following the rules to make sure that there's no quaternary ammonium residues on their food contact surfaces. So I see folks, so any kind of, the way to really protect yourself there is any kind of sanitizer or input that you're using in your facilities, cross-reference it with your certification body, your organic certification body, and make sure that it's approved for use in organic, or that you're following the nuanced restrictions that might accompany a material like that. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes, that's always check in with your certifier. I think it's a general standard rule of thumb, but thank you for kind of highlighting that common pitfall. And then we had another question come in that says, in the first webinar, you spoke of produce growers having a quality control person specifically for FSMA standards. That wasn't brought up today. Is this rule required for both produce and regular food manufacturers?
So under I think I'm interpreting the question right. So under the preventive controls rule, it's required that someone who's a preventive controls qualified individual prepares the food safety plan for that facility. And so for qualified facilities, you're subject to these modified requirements. You're not required to have a food safety plan. So the bulk of that food safety plan is the hazard analysis and the preventive controls. So that's not required of a qualified facility. So you don't have to have someone who has that, we call it the PCQI, the preventive controls qualified individual. You don't have to have a person that has gone through that training prepare, the SOPs and handle all of the documentation that, you're going to be generating even if you're a qualified facility. So for food processors, that's kind of, it's written in the regulation that the food safety plan has to be prepared by this qualified individual. Ideally, that's someone in your business, your operation that knows what you're doing. And, one of the easiest ways to get someone that certification is to attend a training course. But you could also go external and have a consultant prepare the food safety plan for you that has that certificate. The drawback there is that they don't know the nuance of your day-to-day operations. And so, I've run into situations where, processors pay this consultant all the money and they write this food safety plan that really has nothing to do with what they're making. So just a little disclaimer there. If you're a grower, and so you're not now under the preventive controls rule for human food that applies to processed food, you're a grower, you're, selling your fruits, vegetables, you're not processing food. The farm falls under the produce safety rule. And under that regulation, it's not written that you have to have a food safety plan there. Most people opt to kind of build one out because it helps you manage all the documentation that's required. And but for that particular regulation, someone within the operation should attend the Produce Safety Alliance grower training, which is a 1-day course that's specific to that regulation and managing on-farm food safety. So 2 different rules under the same mother regulation and 2 different types of training requirements. So again, if you're confused about which you should be doing, feel free to reach out, because it's a lot of acronyms and regulation names being thrown around, and depending on what you're doing, it could be completely blurry which regulation applies to your business.
Great, thanks. And I should note, CCOF does have some sort of overviews of the produce safety rule. I know that's kind of come up a little bit today, so we can include those in the follow-up email if you're looking for a little more information on that. And then I think, Aaron, you've mentioned a number of times that really a lot of this kind of depends on what an operation is doing and what activities there are. And so the best thing maybe actually just to talk to someone individually about their operation. And we had one operation right in that is producing baked goods that contain a lot of like nuts and seeds and olive oil and honey. It sounds like really delicious. And at the same time, they're also packaging these single items like roast almonds and selling them individually. And they were wondering what rules they fall under.
So it sounds like, at least for the kind of the baked goods piece, it could potentially fall under preventive controls. They may also, depending how big they are, they could probably do that under the cottage food law here in California. So if they're, really small business, they're selling direct to consumers, or they're selling, through a restaurant or a grocery store, that could fall under the cottage food law. If they're a larger business, so I think for the cottage food law, the threshold is, the max is $50,000 per year. So if they're larger, it sounds like this would likely fall under preventive controls rule. They, again, depending on how big they are, they might be one of these qualified facilities. So, I think it sounds like at least the baked goods, they are one of these processed foods. If they weren't doing the baked goods and they were just packing nuts, that might be something that could fall under the produce safety rule, because there's this clear processing happening, I think it sounds like this would be something that would fall under the preventive controls rule. So then they would have to, when they're doing that calculation, if this, it's all in the same business, include in that, annual sales calculation, the sales of the packaged nuts that are just packed, as well as that, baked good product line that they have in the calculation. So I think that's how it would play out. But again, without a lot of details, it's hard to make a definitive claim which way it should go.
Great, thank you. And so we'll take one more final question and then wrap things up. And Jacob and Anna, to kind of pull you back into the conversation again. Someone was wondering, for processors who process both organic and non-organic products, what are some ways they can prevent commingling, or best practices to prevent commingling and cross-contamination?
Yeah, some of our inspectors, when they show up to your operation and you're producing and handling organic and non-organic product, they're going to want to see a really clean break in between runs, or in between handling organic product and non-organic product. And that looks different depending on what products you're producing, but some examples could include, a sanitation break, or, I've seen some operations, there'll be a clean break at the end of the night and all the equipment is sanitized. And then first thing in the morning, they're going to run their organic product first. And then they'll run their conventional product. But if you have to run your conventional product first, we'll want to see records of a full cleaning and sanitation, and potentially even a purge of certain hard to clean equipment that you might not be able to get in there and really clean it. So there's purge records that we'll look for to purge out any conventional product out of those hard to clean pieces of equipment. So hopefully that all makes sense. I hope you guys can share my email as well, jacob@ccof.org. Feel free to email us here at CCOF, because we'd like to be a resource as well.
Great, thank you. And yes, we will be sending out folks contact information, so you'll have that as a resource. And so I think we're going to wrap things up. Erin, thank you so much for that overview and walking through a lot of sort of complex math and different forms in a clear manner. We really appreciate that. And Jacob and Anna, for your insight into the organic side of food processing and food safety. And so I want to move on. We have a couple wrap up slides. Oh, and I forgot the final poll. So this webinar is part of a series of education events that CCOF and UC Cooperative Extension and a number of other folks are collaborating on, and we're still putting together future trainings. So we wanted to just sort of tap your brain as to what trainings would be helpful for you. So if you want to go ahead and fill in the poll and just let us know what type of trainings you'd like to see in the future, we'd really appreciate the feedback. And so we'll just leave that open for a little bit, give folks a chance to respond. And again, it's super helpful to have your input. That way we target our trainings to areas that there's interest in. So I'll give folks a couple more seconds and then I'll end the poll. And so it looks like there's some interest in basic good manufacturing practices, which, as Erin mentioned, we'll have a webinar on that coming up later this year. And then also some interest in the PCQI training and the produce safety role grower training. So thank you very much. That's super helpful, and we'll take that into account as we develop future trainings. Speaking of future trainings, as I mentioned, we have 2 more webinars in this series, and then we'll have more events after that. But in November, we have a webinar that goes more into the details on what fully covered operations need to do for the Preventive Controls rule. And then in December, a good manufacturing practices webinar. And then Erin, do you want to talk about this opportunity?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of trying to develop a kind of free online plug and play food safety course for food processors. And so we're looking for feedback right now from medium, small scale processors on kind of what you perceive the food safety training needs being, and if our current program meets those needs. So if you're willing to take a few minutes to talk to our team, we'd like to pay you for the time. We really appreciate any feedback, insight you have to make sure what we're developing is meeting industry needs. So feel free to reach out to me or to the contact here if you are interested or have questions.
Great, thank you. And Erin mentioned the previous webinar we held in this series, the FSMA 101 for organic food processors. And that webinar, along with all of the other webinars we have produced at C2F, are found on our YouTube channel, so check that out. And then we also have a couple grant opportunities that are open right now. Our Brickmont Hardship Assistance Fund assists organic producers that have experienced hardship. And I know the COVID pandemic is still impacting folks' business. So if you know someone who has experienced hardship and might be interested in applying for a grant, send them to our website. And the grants range from around like $1,000 to $2,500. And then we also just wanted to point out that there are other COVID assistance programs out there, and we have some of those listed on the C2F website. And then also, if you have a high school student in your life who is in the FFA program, we also have our Future Organic Farmer grants open for FFA students. So, you know, a young person excited about organic and wants to do one of their FFA projects on that, we can help fund part of that project. So send them to our website for more information, and the application period ends on November 15th. And with that, we just want to say thank you again to everybody, both our speakers and our audience. As we sign off and you jump out of the webinar, a evaluation form will pop up, and please click on that and give us a little feedback on how we did today and some ideas for future events. So thank you again, and we'll see folks maybe in November for our next webinar. Bye.